Military strategists want you to believe that Germany's mighty defenses collapsed under the weight of Allied tanks, elite infantry units, or overwhelming air power. Hollywood has repeated that same story for decades. Shermans charging through smoke, soldiers storming bunkers, MG-42s roaring in desperate last stands. It's dramatic, cinematic, and completely misleading. Because the real weapon that shattered the German war machine didn't rely on bravery, speed, or luck. It relied on mathematics. Hidden behind the noise of battle, one American artillery piece, the M2 105mm Howitzer, quietly became the single most devastating weapon of industrial warfare. It didn't win through emotion or heroics, but through precision, production, and relentless logic. This gun didn't just fire shells, it fired equations. The M2 Howitzer wasn't just another artillery gun. It was the most mass-produced artillery piece in human history, with more than 10,000 units built by American factories. While Germany struggled to replace tanks and fortifications destroyed in combat, the United States was manufacturing artillery faster than the enemy could even prepare new defensive lines. To German commanders, the discovery was horrifying. The M2 wasn't simply powerful, it was statistically unstoppable. Defending against it meant entering a losing equation where every bunker, every trench, and every machine gun nest was destined to be erased faster than it could be rebuilt. The M2 could fire 4 rounds per minute, hour after hour, without mechanical failure. American doctrine grouped 6 of these guns into a single battery, a small factory of destruction capable of sending 1,440 shells every hour onto a target zone. In just one day, a single battery could deliver over 10,000 rounds, more than many German divisions could produce in the same period. This wasn't just firepower, it was industrial precision applied to the battlefield. The mathematics of destruction had replaced the unpredictability of combat. By the summer of 1944, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Rhine, the M2 was rewriting the rules of warfare, and as the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, the Germans began to understand a new and terrifying truth, that their defensive lines weren't being overrun by courage or tanks. They were being erased by mathematics. The true power of the M2 Howitzer wasn't just in its steel barrel or explosive shells, it was in the system that directed it. American artillery was not a collection of isolated guns firing blindly across the battlefield. It was an interconnected network of mathematics, communication, and precision engineering. This was the Fire Direction Center, or FDC, the invisible brain behind every American artillery battery. Before the FDC, artillery warfare was crude and imprecise. Gunners relied on visual observation, luck, and trial and error to hit their targets. But the Americans changed that forever. They turned artillery into a science. Inside the Fire Direction Center, officers worked over centralized plotting boards, slide rules, and radio relays, calculating the exact coordinates where every shell would land. Dozens of batteries could be synchronized to strike a single point at the same second. To a German soldier, this felt like the hand of God. Invisible, unstoppable, and perfectly timed. German reports from the Western Front spoke of this new terror. "The Americans do not bombard randomly," one captured officer wrote. "They strike as if they can see through the ground. They know where we are before we even open fire." This precision wasn't luck when it was mathematics turned into a weapon. While the M2's raw firepower could already devastate fixed defenses, the addition of coordinated fire made traditional German defense impossible. Dug-in MG-42 nests, tank traps, or fortified bunkers that had once survived hours of shelling were now neutralized in minutes. A single M2 battery could blanket a defensive zone with high explosive shells, but when dozens of batteries fired under FDC coordination, they created overlapping kill zones that annihilated entire defensive lines before the first American infantrymen even advanced. From Normandy to Aachen, from the Ardennes to the Rhine, this new system of precision fire turned German defensive maps into meaningless paper. Every position marked as secure could vanish under a mathematically timed storm of steel within moments. Even the Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, could not match the scale of destruction the M2 could deliver from the ground. A squadron of bombers might drop its payload once a day. A single M2 battery could unleash that same amount of explosive force every few hours, day after day, with unbroken accuracy. The difference was consistency, industrialized, repeatable and unstoppable. To American commanders, this wasn't chaos and it was logistical rhythm. Artillery units worked like factories, producing destruction at predictable rates. Ammunition trucks kept the flow steady, while communication officers ensured that not a single round was wasted. For the Germans, it was a nightmare without pattern or warning. Defensive positions that had once withstood bombardments in previous wars now collapsed almost instantly. The psychological effect was devastating. One German officer captured during the Battle of St. Vith described it perfectly. In the Great War, you could tell when the barrage was coming. You could hide, you could wait. But the American artillery, it has no pattern, no pause. It arrives exactly when it must, and it never misses. That statement captured the new era of warfare. The M2 Howitzer was no longer just a weapon of destruction. It had become the physical embodiment of industrial calculation, a machine that removed chance from battle. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, German commanders no longer thought in terms of defending ground. They thought in terms of time. How long until the next barrage? How many minutes until their defenses vanished? Defense, once a tactical art, had become a countdown equation, and the M2 was solving it faster than Germany could respond. When the mathematics of bombardment met the scale of American industry, the result was not merely tactical. It was existential. The M2 howitzer had already proven its power in raw numbers and precision, but the true ruin came when those numbers began to outpace every assumption of German defensive planning. German defensive doctrine in 1944 still carried the ghosts of an earlier age. Artillery rates, supply calculations, and stockpile planning were built on models that had been serviceable in the Great War and the lean years that followed. Those models assumed that attrition happened in tolerable bursts, days of shelling followed by pauses, supply lines that could limp back to the rear, and fortifications that could be repaired between engagements. The Americans changed all of that. They replaced sporadic punishment with unrelenting arithmetic. Consider the ammunition imbalance. Where German planners had budgeted perhaps 50 rounds per gun per day as a baseline, American batteries were operating at rates that were an order of magnitude higher. In practice, M2 crews routinely fired hundreds of rounds per gun in high-intensity operations, sustained tempo that German logistics simply could not match. A captured German artilleryman later admitted, "We worked on calculations 25 years out of date." That admission wasn't bravado. It was the confession of an entire military paradigm rendered obsolete. This mismatch produced a brutal economic truth. Destruction was vastly cheaper and faster than construction. A reinforced concrete bunker, glassed with labor and months of concrete pours and steel, could be reduced to a smoking ruin by a single coordinated artillery strike in the space of an afternoon. Each shell, cheap, mass-produced, and delivered by trained crews and endless supply chains, represented a tiny fraction of the cost to erect the thing it destroyed. The arithmetic was devastating. An economy built to hold ground could not keep pace with an economy built to erase it. And the consequences were immediate. Fixed linear defenses, long the backbone of German strategy, became liabilities. Commanders who once ordered their troops to hold at all costs began to speak in different terms: mobility, dispersion, avoidance. Field manuals were revised, tactics rethought. The Wehrmacht increasingly traded static lines for elastic defense in depth, for counterattacks and mobile reserves rather than stubbornly manned bunkers. Where once maps were inked with unbroken front lines, they now began to show nodes, mobile wedges, and withdrawal corridors. Psychologically, the effect was corrosive. Troops learned that no position was permanent, that concealment could be betrayed by unseen mathematics, and that the only reliable defense might be flight. Morale, always fickle in war, bent under the knowledge that time, not valor, often decided survival. Frontline officers stopped counting trenches. They started counting minutes. The strategic lesson rippled beyond 1945. After the war, militaries rethought the calculus of emplacement, aiming instead for flexibility and the ability to absorb and reply to industrial firepower, self-propelled artillery, rocket systems, and, much later, precision-guided munitions inherit the DNA of the M2's operational concept. Sustain a high rate of accurate deliverable fires, lean on logistics, and synchronize across distances. The technical trappings changed, but the principle remained. If you can produce and aim more destruction than your enemy can withstand or replace, you win. In the end, the M2's legacy is less a story of a single gun than a story of industrial logic triumphing over static engineering. It proved that modern war was less an argument of bravery and more a balance sheet of capacity. The battlefield had become a ledger, and the Allies, armed with assembly lines, plotting boards, and doctrine, simply outwrote the Germans. Defense was no longer merely a matter of courage. It was a losing mathematical equation. So when historians talk about the collapse of German defenses, they should not only show tanks burning or fighters screaming overhead. They should as well show the quiet plotting boards, the steady churn of ammunition trains, and the cold arithmetic that turned concrete into dust. Because in the ledger of war, the M2 didn't just score points, it changed the rules of the entire game. By 1945, the M2 105mm Howitzer was no longer just a weapon, it was a mathematical instrument of transformation. What began as a simple field gun had evolved into the foundation of a new kind of warfare. Its impact was not measured merely in shells fired or bunkers destroyed, but in the complete redefinition of what it meant to defend, attack, and survive on a modern battlefield. The most profound change was in the concept of artillery superiority. Before the M2, artillery was viewed as a supporting arm, a prelude to infantry attacks or a tool for softening enemy defenses. But with the M2, artillery itself became the decisive arm of warfare. The gun's precision, rate of fire, and centralized coordination allowed it to dictate the pace and structure of battle. It wasn't merely supporting assaults, it was designing them. Infantry and armor advanced where artillery made survival possible. Every movement forward was pre-calculated through trajectories, timings, and grids. The battlefield had turned into a map of equations. American fire control innovation magnified that dominance. The Fire Direction Center (FDC) revolutionized how artillery units operated. Using plotting boards, range tables, and communication lines, the FDC could synchronize dozens of batteries spread over miles to hit a single point at the exact same second. To German defenders, it felt like the sky itself had become weaponized. The sound of a single shell no longer mattered. It was the silence before thousands arrived at once. Each barrage was not chaos. It was the product of deliberate geometry. This level of synchronization destroyed the psychological balance of warfare. German soldiers, who had once trained to endure rolling barrages and counter-battery fire, now faced bombardments that were surgical in their precision. A position could be wiped out before a single distress call reached headquarters. Trenches became temporary. Bunkers became tombs. The Wehrmacht learned quickly that to remain stationary was to die. The tactical doctrine of linear defense, fixed fortifications, layered trenches, and static gun emplacements became obsolete. Commanders who once prided themselves on holding every inch of ground now found that such rigidity invited annihilation. The M2 didn't just destroy positions. It destroyed the very idea that a position could be defensible. As one German colonel later admitted, "We no longer fought for ground. We fought for time, and time was running out." The logistical advantage that powered the M2's constant fire made any sustained defense mathematically hopeless. American industry could produce ammunition faster than the Germans could dig in. Every shell fired didn't just destroy an enemy asset, it deepened the gap between two industrial systems. In a sense, every M2 round was a message. You cannot outlast this machine. By the final months of the war, even American commanders understood they were witnessing something historic. Artillery had proven that industrial output, when precisely applied, could overcome tactical ingenuity. German engineers designed magnificent defenses, concrete fortresses, camouflaged nests, armored positions, yet they all fell to a weapon mass-produced by the thousands. The M2 turned the war into an equation that only one side had the means to solve. When the war ended, nations took note. The Soviets developed entire doctrines around artillery saturation. The British refined counter-battery radar and fire direction, and the Americans, learning from their own creation, built the next generation, self-propelled guns, mechanized batteries, and eventually rocket artillery capable of delivering destruction on an even greater scale. Every modern artillery system, from the M109 Paladin to the HIMARS rocket launcher, carries the DNA of the M2's philosophy. precision through coordination, dominance through production, victory through mathematics. The M2 Howitzer did not just fire shells. It fired a warning to every army that would ever again rely on static defense. It proved that courage and engineering alone could not resist the sheer logic of industrial warfare. The lesson was eternal. In the age of mass production and precision coordination, no wall, no fortress, and no defensive line could survive the arithmetic of modern firepower. When the last echoes of the M2's thunder faded over Europe, its influence didn't end and it only evolved. The 105 mm howitzer had not just broken the German lines, it had broken the limits of old military thinking. Its success became a case study for every army preparing for the next war, and its lessons would echo through every decade of the Cold War that followed. The post-war world was defined by industrial parity and ideological rivalry. The United States and the Soviet Union both recognized that artillery, not tanks or planes, had been the true architect of battlefield victory. What separated them was how they interpreted that lesson. For the Americans, the M2 proved that precision and coordination could achieve dominance through efficiency. For the Soviets, the same data revealed another truth. Overwhelming firepower could replace precision entirely. In the late 1940s, American strategists transformed the M2's principles into a broader doctrine known as artillery supremacy. The focus shifted from the gun itself to the network that made it lethal. Forward observers, rangefinders, weather stations, and fire direction centers became as important as the weapon they served. Artillery became a system, not a tool. Each component, the gun, the shell, the calculation, the communication line, worked as part of a coordinated machine that could deliver destruction anywhere, anytime, in any weather. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union took a different path. To them, the M2 symbolized something even more fundamental: the power of mass production. They believed that victory came not from precision but from quantity made unstoppable. Soviet engineers developed entire fleets of artillery, from the 122mm D-30 howitzer to the massive 203mm guns capable of leveling city blocks. Their doctrine of God of War, a title they proudly gave to artillery, was rooted in the same industrial logic that had powered the American M2. If you can build and fire faster than the enemy can respond, you will eventually win. But it was the Americans who turned the M2's tactical lessons into technological evolution. In the 1950s, they mechanized their artillery. The M108 and M109 self-propelled howitzers replaced towed guns, allowing artillery to move with armored units rather than lag behind them. This mobility completed the transformation the M2 had started. Artillery was no longer a static line behind the front. It was part of a continuously moving, integrated force. As technology advanced, so did precision. The fire direction centers that once used plotting boards and radios were replaced by computers and satellites. By the 1970s, digital fire control systems allowed artillery to hit targets miles away with near-perfect accuracy. The logic was still the same as the M2's: coordination, mathematics, and logistics, but now executed at electronic speed. And yet, even as the tools evolved, the spirit of the M2 remained at the heart of every design. Every new system, from the American M777 lightweight howitzer to the HIMARS rocket artillery, still obeyed the same principle: destruction as an equation of production and precision. Each system multiplied the effectiveness of a few guns through synchronization, just as the M2 batteries once had with their fire direction centers across Europe. The M2's legacy also changed how nations measured military power. Once, armies were judged by their tanks or aircraft. After the M2, analysts began to look at something else: supply chains, logistics, and industrial output. Wars were no longer decided by who had the strongest soldiers or best generals, but by who could build, supply, and sustain the machinery of destruction the longest. Even today, modern warfare still speaks the language the M2 created. In conflicts across the world, whether it's GPS-guided artillery in Ukraine, precision drones in the Middle East, or autonomous targeting systems in the Pacific, the fundamental logic remains identical to that of the M2. Turn defense into a losing equation through volume, precision, and synchronization. The M2 howitzer may have been retired, its barrels cold and silent, but its doctrine never died. It lives in every firing solution, every satellite-guided strike, every battlefield where mathematics and machinery decide fate faster than human reflexes can. The M2 was not just a weapon of its time, It was the blueprint for the future of war. When historians speak of the M2 105mm howitzer, they often describe its technical genius, its fire rate, its precision, its production scale. But what they rarely mention is how it changed something deeper, the human experience of war itself. The M2 didn't just dominate the battlefield. It redefined how soldiers, commanders, and even nations thought about conflict. It transformed war from a contest of bravery into a system of production, logistics, and psychology. For centuries, warfare had been shaped by human presence, soldiers fighting face-to-face, courage determining the outcome. The M2 replaced that intimacy with distance and mathematics. A crew could unleash devastation miles away from their target, guided not by sight but by calculation. War became abstract. You no longer fought the man in front of you. You fought numbers on a plotting board, coordinates on a map, and probabilities on a chart. Victory became a mathematical certainty rather than a personal triumph. This shift carried immense psychological weight. German soldiers during World War II described American artillery not as a weapon, but as a force of nature. It didn't matter how brave you were or how well you hid. When the M2 batteries opened fire, survival depended on luck and timing, not courage. It was a kind of terror unknown to earlier wars. A mechanical, relentless, and impersonal destruction that made individual heroism irrelevant. The battlefield became a place where calculation replaced valor. For the Americans, this was both a victory and a revelation. Commanders realized that industrial war demanded not just good soldiers, but efficient systems. Every shell fired, every barrel replaced, every truckload of ammunition mattered. The real heroes of the M2 were not the gunners on the front line, but the factory workers back home. Men and women producing the endless flow of steel and powder that made such firepower possible. The line between soldier and worker blurred. The factory floor became as decisive as the battlefield. Out of this realization emerged something larger, the birth of what would later be called the military-industrial complex. The M2 was proof that economic power and military success were inseparable. To sustain that kind of firepower, a nation needed not only soldiers but entire industries dedicated to constant production, innovation, and logistics. Factories, railways, and supply depots became strategic assets, protected as fiercely as cities or airfields. America had learned that victory came from systems, not single weapons. This philosophy carried into the Cold War, when military strength was measured less by the courage of armies and more by the depth of industrial capacity. Nations competed not only in the field, but in production statistics, tons of steel, barrels of oil, and the number of artillery shells in reserve. The M2's legacy had created a new kind of arms race, one of mathematics and manufacture. The hero was no longer the man charging into battle, but the engineer designing a better gun or the economist funding its production. Yet this transformation also carried a moral cost. War became more detached, more efficient, and therefore more frequent. When destruction is industrialized, it becomes easier to wage and harder to stop. The M2 had shown that mass production could turn war into an equation, but it also hinted that such equations could continue endlessly if unchecked. Humanity had discovered how to make killing scalable. Still, the M2's revolution cannot be dismissed as purely mechanical or cruel. It represented a new understanding of war, one that valued coordination, intelligence, and efficiency over raw bloodshed. It proved that in the modern world, the side that mastered organization would always defeat the side that relied solely on courage. The psychological and political echoes of that truth remain with us today. Every modern army, every defense budget, and every new piece of military technology carries the DNA of the M2 howitzer's logic. It was the weapon that made nations realize victory is not about who fights hardest, it's about who calculates best. Long after its barrels fell silent, the M2 105mm howitzer continued to shape the world it once shattered. What began as an artillery gun became a symbol, not of destruction alone but of transformation. It marked the moment when industrial logic fully conquered the battlefield, when human conflict became not about bravery or tactics but about output, coordination, and precision. Its lessons spread far beyond America's borders. Every major power studied the M2's performance and drew conclusions that shaped decades of military doctrine. The Soviets built massive artillery networks inspired by its relentless fire tempo. The British refined forward observation and counter-battery coordination. Even smaller nations adopted its principles: centralized fire control, rapid logistics, and the fusion of production with strategy. The M2 had taught the world that war was no longer about lines on a map, but about numbers in motion. But perhaps its greatest legacy was philosophical. The M2 proved that technology could make defense obsolete, that no wall or fortress could withstand the mathematics of modern industry. It forced militaries, engineers, and governments to accept a grim new truth: permanence was an illusion. Every structure, no matter how solid, existed only until the next barrage began. This realization extended into the Cold War and beyond. The M2's doctrine evolved into the age of rockets, nuclear deterrence, and precision-guided munitions. Its spirit lived on in weapons like the M109 Paladin, the M777 Howitzer, and even satellite-guided artillery systems that can strike within meters from hundreds of miles away. Each of them, in essence, is an echo of the M2, a continuation of the idea that victory belongs to those who can calculate faster, produce more, and strike first. Yet amid its mechanical triumph lies a haunting reminder. The M2 Howitzer was proof of human ingenuity, but also proof of our capacity to turn intelligence into devastation. It made war efficient, but in doing so made it impersonal. The battlefield it created was one ruled not by courage or mercy, but by the cold certainty of mathematics, and that is the true legacy of the M2. A weapon that didn't just win battles, it forever changed what it means to fight, to build, and to believe in the power of human creation.